Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
We were comparing notes on our experiences and how traumatic experiences can mess with your memory. And so I look back on my military career, and I can remember genuinely very little about it. But what I do remember, because I see them, are still a series of images that have been burnt into my memory, for reasons that you'll understand. It's the way your memory records certain events at the time. And the emotion's been detached from those events now, but the pictures are still there. But what that means is that because the memory over time is so broken, that you don't have the positive references. And actually there's enough there to sort of look back and think, oh my God, my career was pretty crap.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. Tim, welcome to the podcast, my friend. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. Thank you for having me, Pete. Pretty good. Great day to be alive.
Yeah, man. I know you're a busy guy. So we sort of initially connected because there's been a myriad of reports over the last couple of years of this growing concern for me personally, and I know for a lot of other people, around mental health in generally in the society, but certainly in the first responder sector. And I was looking up on some stuff from the London School of Economics. They did a study that kind of came out last year. I mean, I've got it in front of me now. It was around 120 billion or 118 billion annually. It kind of costs the UK economy. And we had guests on a number of years ago that spoke about how much this is almost put on a heightened sense of concern in our emergency services, and certainly in our frontline boys and girls as well, certainly within the military. And I know you've delved into a hell of a lot of this, and finally someone that's also doing something about it, because we can all talk about it and appreciate the challenges that sort of face us, but you've kind of gone one step further with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of that resonates with me personally. I think there is a harsh truth here, which, and it's a theory of mine, but it's one that I see play out time and time again. And it is, as humans, we simply don't pay attention to things until they're serious enough, they get bad enough, they're important enough to us. And I think accepting that to a certain degree is helpful to sort of understand the context we're operating in here. And I think that happens at both a personal and an organizational level. And my personal story that I know we're going to touch on at times, on reflection, it really exposed, that failing in me personally, that because I didn't recognize it, didn't have the awareness, I then couldn't really develop the intention to do anything about it. And then the action wasn't taken. And only when it gets bad enough, and in my case, I basically fell over in a big way, sort of 10 years after an initial experience, we're not really well positioned to target the right action to either get us out of a hole or move us further forward.
So to give us some context on that background, you served in the British Army for 14 years.
Yeah.
Why did you first want to move into the army? And, that the army really is what initially, in my limited understanding, is where a lot of these realizations came from. When we think of things like mental health first aiders, we think of things like TRIM. I wonder if it was because of some of the tragic, well, it often is the case, some of these innovations and some of these realizations come from some tragic stories of it going terribly wrong. But you served for 14 years in the British Army. Give us some background on when you first went in, what your thought process was moving into the military, and why it was a passion of yours.
I probably did what a lot of people do. And I just sort of followed the path that was set for me, which was, you're obviously going to university, aren't you? Yeah, I guess so. And so I did that. And I did sort of industrial design, product design, and I had already a developing intention to go into the military. But I think what confirmed that that was a good idea was that I realized I was quite crap at product design. So I so so I didn't commit to the army until the end of those sort of 3 years of university. I did have family in the military, sort of classic push off point there, but that wasn't the reason why. I just felt like I was a really good values fit for that type of organization, and I wanted to be a soldier.
What is that values fit? Sorry, when you say you think you would be a good fit,
Well,
what do you think that assumed context is for someone that goes into the military?
I think I was pretty certain that I was a man of integrity. I was good operating in a team. I really believe in the sense of service beyond oneself, that actually you can experience more and achieve more within teams, particularly in either high performing environments or tough environments, going through tough experiences that you just simply wouldn't experience as an individual. Operating on your own and sort of staying on your comfort zone. So, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty when you have the idea of committing to a career path, but you don't really know what it entails other than what you see on sort of recruiting videos and all the shiny stuff that is designed to catch your eye. But I didn't really know anyone who had gone that way just before me. It was just generations before my family that had been in the military. So I knew ultimately I was going to follow that path, and I was quite lucky to start with, in that I wanted to go and serve in commando forces, and I had that opportunity early. And so my formative years, first sort of 3 years or so in the military, I had the opportunity to serve in commando forces, and I really built on that sense of identity that I knew was there, but needed really molding into something more specific around a cap badge and a specific identity. And I suppose I was craving that's what I wanted to see myself become, in a way, very much like anyone joining public service.
Yeah, it's a strange thing, isn't it? We have this idea of what we think it will mean to become a person that does a thing just like that. Do you know what I mean? And I wonder if there's an aspect of that that actually, on the other side of the coin, means we struggle most when we realize that that thing is no longer for us, or we start to close that chapter of life. And that's where I see some of the massive issues with people retiring from the police, people retiring from military services, and certainly when they leave the military, it's almost that drop shock in reverse, because so much of their identity has been built around the thing that they do.
Absolutely. Like, you would have spoken, I'm sure, to other guests in the past around the importance of identity and sense of purpose, clarity on who
Mm.
you are, not necessarily what you can become, but who you are and whether you're a good fit for something. And we know the transition out of any organization after those formative years, often your best years, is really, really
Mm.
difficult. But from personal experience as well, losing or completely losing your sense of identity and the faith that you have and the belief you have in yourself is a horrible experience to go through, because naturally it's very difficult to accept sometimes the circumstances you find yourself in when you're going through that change. Um,
Mm.
but also there's a grief, isn't there? I think that people report,
You're
because
mourning
it
yourself.
wasn't the
It's the death
plan.
of that
Yeah,
person.
yeah. This,
Yeah.
starting with plan B that was never planned as a plan B at a time not of your choosing was not your plan.
Yes.
It shouldn't have ended this
Yeah.
way. So there's a lot of grief, I think, that comes with people leaving service. Um, and of course, people leave for different reasons. So, some people get to the point that they've served a full career and they retire. That's really hard for them because actually they want to keep
Mm.
going. People leave.
Well, careers in the military are also quite short, really, aren't they, in
Yeah.
comparison to
Um,
civilian life?
but, yeah, people still do at times serve for sort of 35, 36 years. And that's a
Mm.
properly good innings. Um,
Mm.
Almost at that point, there isn't much time left to do, something else.
Yes.
Um, so I can see it's a double-edged sword perhaps. But actually, someone I was chatting to this morning, former firefighter, uh, came up with something quite nice, which was the assumption, or the way that he saw it from his perspective, was that so many years in another public organisation was almost like the equivalent of dog years in the military. That military years, they lasted longer, so you didn't have to do so much time in the
Yeah.
military for it to feel like it's a
Yeah.
full career. And
Mm.
I'm not necessarily convinced that my career played out that way, but it definitely went pretty quickly. And that's something I'm sure a
Mm.
lot of people resonate with. It goes quite quickly, and then you wish you could have more of it sometimes.
So try and give people, if you can, because it's very new to me, even though I've spoken to a few people around it. When we speak about the wellness of an individual or the mental and physical health of it, physical is something that I feel we always get drawn to, especially in the military, because they require a high element of physical proficiency. But
Yeah.
from a mental context, what sort of things were in place when you first joined, or even as you started to come to these challenges towards the end of your career? What did levels of support look like at that point?
Yeah, so I think it's probably important to mention that in the wider context of public service that if you join the military and you join as officer, you're very lucky that you have a complete year of focused leadership training,
Yeah.
and that arguably um, irons out some of the creases, sets you on the right path, gives you a foundation to push off from. It's where ultimately you build your confidence, you develop that sense of identity further. You get some sort of idea of what it is you're actually going to do. Because when you start day one at Sandhurst, you sort of know what you're intending to expose yourself
Mm.
to, but you generally have got no idea what's gonna show up. On the real day one when you go to your
Yeah.
unit. So I think I've got to appreciate that I was very lucky to have like some really high quality training to set myself up.
Mm.
I think what goes with that though, on the flip side, is that there is in many organizations, and I felt like this was the case in the military when I served, there are a huge number of assumptions around the mental and emotional skills that someone um, arrives with at the point
Mm.
of entry and the things that they will naturally develop during their initial year of training, and therefore those ones that are set to serve them well through their career. I think I was guilty of making an assumption that my mental and emotional agility and the skills that came with that were far more developed than they were. And even when I hit the ground on my first tour, and although my experience happened quite quickly, I'm trying to make a point around the fact that even at the individual level, after lots of
Mm.
training with a clear idea of what it is you're letting yourself in for, we can over egg our emotional and mental agility and how we
Mm.
deal with things like trauma in the context that we've probably never experienced those things in our life.
That gave me, when you were saying that, and I think about leadership development in that context, one of the main things around leadership development is it does encourage a lot of self reflection, doesn't it? Self awareness, that sort of man in the mirror aspect. So
Yeah.
you do have to reflect on your own approaches and your own impact on other people, which by nature of it encourages you to build a little bit more resiliency and a little bit more mental agility. But was it a book by, have you ever read Grit?
I haven't, no.
Grit is a book by Angela Duckworth, and I'm quite confident some of her studies took place with people in Sandhurst. Grit is effectively about why passion and resilience are the secrets to success, and she uses it in a military framework. And grit was one of the metrics that they ranked people by who were ultimately successful in things like officer training and longevity within the military
Mm.
and other emergency services. And I think that's a very difficult thing to apply a metric to. But then when I listen to you and looking back at some of the things you picked up during those years of development, there is almost
Mm.
some element of assumption that whatever that process is will develop that kind of grit and resiliency within somebody. But I don't know if that's always the case.
Yeah, I don't think you can make an assumption that someone's going to have to develop the requisite qualities around agility and resilience by the time they're 18, 21, or whatever it is.
No.
Clearly at that point, they don't even expose themselves to the organization and what the work the organization does and the sorts of experiences that are coming their way. So
Mm.
how can you safely assume that people have got what it takes, without ultimately putting them to the test and people experiencing those? Of
Mm.
course, people develop resilience off the back of good and bad experiences. Um, we can't ultimately grow until we learn some personal lessons. But I think what is important to any leader is that there's a pretty sound understanding of self. There's
Mm.
there's quite a clarity established around self-knowledge, who you are, how you can add value, where you can add value, how you communicate. But of course, those skills are developed and they're shaped as the careers play out.
So, as your career began to play out, when was the first kind of moment that you realized your current mental model was not serving you in the best way possible?
I think it was probably that early experience and operational tour. So I don't really remember having any tough experiences up until that point. And I remember prior to actually our pre-deployment training, there was a period where we weren't sure whether we were going to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. And then it became clear that we were going to Afghanistan. It's called Operation Harriet 5. What time of year was it? So late 2006, mid to late 2006.
Okay.
And you'll have a loose understanding of the sort of operating environment we're going to go into. Now, of course, for a young troop commander, this is first tour, and there's all sorts of stuff that comes with that. Uncertainty, how you're going to operate, how you're going to fare, etc. And I found myself deploying late out to theatre on that tour because I was still running the regimental commando training team where we prepared people to go off to do their all arms commando training. So I deployed out in December. I'd been out in theatre about a couple of days, and then I had to head down south, Southern Helmand, to take over someone else's troop because they got injured. And it just so happened that about an hour or two, having landed in that FOB location, I say FOB loosely because at this stage it was effectively two 105 light guns and supporting vehicles facing outwards. This was pre any FOB structures. Having really been
I was going to
creative
say, for
beyond
people
that.
that are unfailure,
Yeah,
so FOB is a forward
that's
operating
right.
base that theoretically should have some infrastructure in place for
Yeah,
people to tactically deploy from at speed, ironically.
yeah. Yeah, but we're talking about a sort of 100 square meter patch of desert with everything pointing outwards. So about 2 hours after actually landing and meeting a couple of people, effectively we went out on a what was a recce patrol, which was part of my handover takeover. And it was on that initial patrol where the first vehicle had a landmine landed on its roof, although it didn't have a roof. And that first experience played out, and that experience was, without going into too much detail, pretty traumatic in itself, and it really was the one that then was the catalyst for all of the trouble for me that developed, and it effectively very quickly turned
I'm
into a
surprised it
rescue
didn't start
operation.
sooner. Sorry to interrupt, but like
It's fine.
when you knew that you were going to take command of a team that was absent its leader because of injury, was there not already that context within your mind? Because there's a big aspect of when firefighters get injured. I know there is that survivor bias, but also when people know that it could have been them as well, that can sometimes be a large thing that builds in people's minds that can add to their own anxiety and stuff like that. Was there never that aspect for you that I know it's, again, we talk about this assumed, oh, well, I know what I'm going in for and I know what I'm going to do. But someone that was in the position that you're about to step into isn't there at the minute because they've been injured doing the thing you're about to go and do.
Yeah, so there's probably a couple of things in this. Firstly, that injury to that guy was probably very different to the type of injury you might have expected from
Okay.
working in a hostile environment, combat zone, that sort of thing. But I think my honestly, my ignorance and lack of reference points probably helped at that point. And and
Okay.
and so that didn't really, for me at the time, didn't really creep into my thinking. Um, I think additionally to that, there's probably an element of sort of brash, overconfident, naive, again ignorant young
Yeah.
officer, not really have a full understanding of the environment he's operating in. And that's not to say
Yeah.
we, of course, drove deliberately straight over a landmine.
No.
The nature of the place was that these things were all over the place and not always marked on the map, as it were. Which, by the way, at that stage, the mapping was absolutely terrible. Like 1 in 100,000 didn't really, give you much of the north, south, east, west. So yeah, I think just lack of reference points, and we'll probably come back to this later when we talk about detail, but lack of reference points um, can sometimes, I think, help or hinder us when we're facing challenge.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Hmm. No, no, it does, yeah, because you don't have a context within which to place your
Mm.
trauma sometimes. There's no there's no reference points. So talk to me again about that initial incident and why that was such a jump off point for this sort of, I don't want to say spiral, that sounds a bit of an
Yeah,
exaggeration, but that was the first trigger point.
yeah. So found ourselves in this situation effectively 8 kilometers from the gun position. Radio's gone, disconnected, multiple casualties. And one guy clearly was trapped under the vehicle. We managed to extract one guy who in the end, sadly lost his leg. Um, but then the second guy we tried to rescue, we just simply could not get him out of the upturned vehicle. There was a fire took hold, and it's one that ultimately we couldn't control, and that all happened quite quickly. And so for me, I think having never had an experience like that before, it was quite an extreme traumatic experience relative to the things I had in life.
Mm.
Even though that might sound bizarre, because I should have really had an understanding of the sorts of things that could play out in theatre. But I immediately took personal responsibility for the failure to get that guy out before he died. And it's interesting because this is probably my only experience of this, but I remember me and the guy that I was with in that situation um, feeling at times like we still had the ability to two-man lift the Land Rover off someone,
Mm.
however many tons it was. There's almost a confidence for a period of time that there's a problem to solve here. We'll work it out. But if it
Yeah.
involves just rolling this Land Rover, we'll just make that happen, which is clearly delusional. Um, but maybe that suggests the shifts in our thinking when we're going through those experiences. I think that type of mindset clearly can help us in those situations sometimes, because
Yeah.
it's the opposite of having no self-confidence, giving up on the situation, etc. So you just keep going, keep going, keep going. And I remember that being quite bizarre. But I personally took responsibility in that moment for that failure, and ultimately, although I got injured, recovered quite quickly, and then stayed in theatre the rest of the tour, it was only the point I came back that those things started to resurface, having suppressed them for 4 or 5 months. And they really showed up as really dominant feelings of anger, shame, and guilt, which, as you'll know, are pretty powerful in their own
Mm.
right, particularly if they're linked to something that you think should have gone differently, particularly something that you personalize, particularly something you can't reverse.
Mm.
Um, but when they're on top of each other, layered and compounding, then it on paper can become really problematic.
What's the process of debriefing an incident like that? Sorry. When an incident like that happens in theatre, what's the after action report, or how do you debrief that?
At the time, it was I can't. It was 1 or 2 days, 2 days in hospital, I think, and we talked about memory loss when we talked in the past, and this was definitely the first time that
Mm.
kicked in, and I was convinced for a period of time that I'd been hospitalized for 2 weeks. In the end, it turned out it was only
Really?
2 days. Yeah. Whether that's time sped up or slowed down, I can't figure out. My brain's too small, but that definitely was a first bizarre experience. But in terms of debrief,
Because that can sometimes help process it, can't it?
yeah,
Sorry to interrupt.
absolutely.
We try and debrief as whole teams because the view of the driver versus the view of the BA team inside versus we all have different collective knowledge of the situation, and it can sometimes help you give a holistic understanding to what really happened.
Absolutely. I think the timing of that is really key. So,
Mm.
from a medical perspective, I feel like I was allowed to own the truth as I painted it in my mind, which was this what happened, and this guy died because I failed to save him. 24 hours later, it took a doctor to confirm that he was likely to die from blast injuries anyway. But
Mm.
because I'd already embedded my own truth at that point, even to this day, to a certain extent, I still don't really buy that truth that the doctor presented me. And my point here is that I think when debriefing, the timing of that debrief and the person that runs that debrief, they're two really critical things, because so much can happen off the back of a traumatic experience in quite a short period of time that can become problematic for an individual or for a group of individuals, because the mind starts firing off, assumptions start embedding themselves, assumptions become truths even though they're not based on facts. There is no value in a debrief happening 1, 2, 3 days later just to tick a box. Whatever format it takes, whether it's initial debrief with a clear purpose in mind, followed up by a different type of debrief, that initial stuff has to happen, particularly I think for the mental health of and probably the sanity of those individuals involved from that point forward.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. So you did take part in one after you come out of hospital?
Yeah. There was a trim debrief. 2 Royal Marines guys. I know one was a Sergeant Major, so trim was quite new to the military.
Trim was already embedded by then, was it?
It was
already operating
within. It was around. Yes, the Royal Marines were some of the pioneers of trim within the military.
Okay.
And of course, things like PTSD and so on are not new to soldiers, as they are not new to firefighters and police officers, and of course NHS staff. But trim in that guise was relatively new and was pioneered by 3 Commander Brigade, but it was quite informally delivered. And I'm not in a position to criticise trim, because it was something that was available to me in that moment that wasn't available to people maybe 6, 12 months beforehand.
Yes.
But the key thing was they were people wearing the same colour beret as me, from ultimately my parent organisation that I related to. That for that reason I immediately trusted more than I would probably clinicians and specialists. And they created.
That's why I see the value. Sorry to jump forward, but that's why I see the value in some of the stuff that you're doing now. Because with the greatest of respect, there's some incredible academics and some credible people that specialize in the psychology of trauma, but unfortunately, for better or worse, they don't have as great a level of authenticity, because again, we talk about context. They don't have a context in which to place it. So the difference between empathy and sympathy is more difficult for them because they've not been there.
I completely relate to that, and I agree with it. And I think I'm fast forwarding a bit here, but my experience with clinicians is quite mixed, and I'm not going to knock them here, but I think sometimes it feels a bit detached, and actually nothing can replace having your own people around you. With the best intentions. Ideally, they're in your circle of trust, but clearly they relate to you, they get you, they've probably had some shared experiences, they don't need to have had the same experiences, but you get each other. Like, there's rapport, there's trust, there's empathy, all those things. Even though it might, if we're honest, be the first time that someone ultimately is experiencing that, it makes a massive difference to people. And I think I'm very clear in the work we do now that there is only so much that I can relate to, some of the people we help, because I am not a firefighter. I never have been. I'm not a police officer, and I never have been. I'm not a paramedic. I never have been, etc. But I do feel there's something there, and there's service beyond myself, and things I can help people with. But that's why I absolutely believe that the organisations have to drive these narratives from within, even with the help of people like us who they may trust or may have never met before, because the people around us are the ones who ultimately can help us in those moments. They're the people that get us, and they're people that probably know us best and know what's best for us.
I've heard you speak before around the aspect of almost shared responsibility, whereas we used to look at this sort of stuff as something that belonged to the mental health experts or belonged to HR or the health and wellness team or whatever. And that almost acted as an excuse for people to back away from those uncomfortable conversations through probably fear of getting it wrong, but also feeling like they don't even have the tools to help this person and they don't want to make it any worse. And then that person was just left adrift to, continue to mentally self-harm without to.
No, absolutely. And I think, that's absolutely, as you picked up on, that's what I believe. And having spoken to a lot of people around this subject area over the last 4 or 5 years, I know that there are a lot of other people that believe they share the same belief, that there is a shared belief,
Mm.
shared responsibility when it comes to um, managing our mental health and protecting it and improving it and getting ahead of this stuff. And what I mean by that, and of course, I'll say again, I am in no way a clinician or an expert in this stuff, but that's ultimately the point. You don't have to be an expert, So I feel that there's too much pressure put on leaders and line managers sometimes to not only create and maintain the right environments, but be the person to have that conversation when that conversation is required.
Mm.
If indeed there have been opportunities maybe for people to um, learn from past experiences, um, come to the table, share what they're struggling with, exercise better self-care, get on top of their habits. And I'm very conscious that at this point, I could be losing some of the crowd, but my point is that I think looking back, and probably a lot of people would relate to this, there are always opportunities for better habits, better
Mm.
self-knowledge, better self-awareness that we do not take. But in my
Mm.
experience, the reason that people often don't take that and those opportunities to do more of the good stuff rather than the sort of um, depleting stuff is that they don't have anything to push off from. So we can't judge people if they don't necessarily have a sufficient level of awareness, knowledge, skill in an area that they've never really tapped into before. We've got to recognize people aren't taught about this stuff. Like, we're
Yeah.
taught about the benefits of physical health and education. You hear people talk about that a lot. Um, but the reason people don't do it a lot is because they simply don't have the time, the space, and the permission in their working environment to prioritize themselves. Like, we've got to remember that people that come into public service, they come into public service most often because they see that they can serve a level beyond themselves. They
Mm.
they join to serve. In the
Yeah.
army, our
They want to be
mantras,
part of
yeah,
something that they feel
we
matters.
we
They feel has a great moral
we
compass in their
serve to
community
lead.
or their nation.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And we recognize that there are people, less fortunate than us, that we have to put ourselves out there to help. And so
Mm.
naturally, as a result of that sort of sense of identity and that clarity and intent in how we offer ourselves to the world, we have to recognize that we're likely to put ourselves last, and
Yes.
particularly in each and every moment where it's help that person or help myself, prioritize helping that person or prioritize my own stuff. You're never going to take your own stuff,
Mm.
and that
Yeah.
becomes an embedded thing, and it can operate um, sort of cyclically within cultures where the work demand is such, and I know that this happens across all public sectors. Um, the work demand is such that there is just no time, there is no sense of space, and actually the
Mm.
behaviours of others, particular leaders, often compromises the sense of permission. It doesn't allow it to us, and when it comes to permission, sometimes we have got the ability to give it to ourselves, but quite often we need to see that someone else gives it to us before we can give it to ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
self-care we know is critical, but self-care objectively is often quite difficult to exercise if you're a public servant for the reasons we explained, and because the operating environment is still not creating the conditions for people to properly look
Mm.
after themselves, either proactively, preventatively, or seek the right support and find the right people that can help them when things go wrong.
Well, culturally, we build ourselves around service to others, don't
Yeah,
we? And like you say, when you see leaders in organizations, and we ironically championed it for many, many years about, working late into the night
yeah,
and unsociable hours and helping people in their hour of need, which tends to be a time that's not convenient for everybody else. So in that culture of service, it just to become embedded in someone's blueprint to put others before themselves.
yeah. So I think we have to accept that as an expected behaviour. That's absolutely not wrong, because quite often, if we had a bad experience, or like in my case, I exited the organisation because I was told that was happening. It was taken a decision taken away from me as a result of where my mental health was at. You look back and you think, oh, if only I'd taken those opportunities for self care, if only I had the time and space of permission, the understanding, the education, the knowledge, and all those things I didn't have, if only, and that's not a good place to be. And one of my submissions really is to help people to pay attention soon enough that it doesn't have to get to the point that it's bad enough for them to take action, and worst case that it's too late. In that, of course,
Action is taken
people,
upon them. Yeah.
yeah, they either lose their career because of poor mental health and the conditions that are developed that didn't need to develop, or of course, tragically, that someone takes their own life.
Mm.
So we've got to just, I think, absolutely accept the reality of the situation that individuals find themselves in, and recognize that this stuff is really difficult still in that operating environment, in that context. Even picking up on when you're starting to dip and decline, or when you're dipping into a further decline, because we're constantly establishing new norms in our own mind that's personal to us. You don't recognize that creep. And before too long, the only indication you get is people start saying, what's happened to you? What's wrong with you? Like, what's going on? Look at your
You just think
face.
that's the person you are now. You're like, well, we all change over time, and I'm just a pessimistic person. Or you start a narrative in your head that you are X or you are Y, and that becomes your new norm. That becomes your new set point.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm always tired. I'm always this. I'm always agitated.
Yeah.
I've never had healthy self awareness, or I've never had a healthy self ego or self confidence.
Yeah.
I'm not a confident person, and all those aspects of it. Connecting the dots, looking backwards now over your career as it progressed from there, you've mentioned there a lot around these habits, behaviors, things that you, looking back, missed those opportunities for that self-correction, for that recalibration. Talk to me about the resulting damage of that creep and how it ultimately led to having that decision taken away from you.
Yeah, sure. So I think a general point or reflection at this stage is that from about early 2007 to, I would say, somewhere in 2018, once I left the organization, my thinking and my mental health was just like a complete yo-yo. And what I would tend to do, because I put a lot of pressure on myself, that when I had that early experience, because it was so early, my response tended to be to challenge or adversity. I'm going to find a way back. I'm going to bounce back. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to prove something else to myself that qualifies, who I am as a person. And so I remember a number of times where I felt quite strongly that this wasn't for me. I'm not worthy of carrying on this career. I need to leave. And then the thing on the other shoulder would start driving a narrative, which is, don't let that happen. Don't listen to yourself. You got to go again. So it's just constantly reinforcing these negative, I suppose they were negative thinking patterns, but it was very yo-yo in nature. And it generally built and built and built to increasing self-induced pressure. So I remember in about 2008, things got a bit ropey with my partner. I started to become isolated, disconnected, wanted to be on my own all the time. Then I had a word of myself. All right, I'm going to do the next best thing I can in my service. I'm going to go for airborne selection and go back to Afghanistan. I'm going to prove that this time, nothing's going to go wrong. It's gonna be a good experience. And so that's how things played out. In between these sort of jobs and these operational tours, I tended to go to training jobs.
Was that an assumption as well, though? Sorry to interrupt. That something else is going to give me the validation that I need.
Absolutely.
I'm unable to give it to myself. I need to do a thing, or I need to be proven by my by my competency. That's what's going to fix this. That's what's going to, and nothing externally usually ever fixes the internal, because it's the story you're telling yourself, not the story someone else is telling you.
Yeah, and I mean, I often refer to this phrase that you can't think your way out of a problem, you can't think your way out of a paper bag, you need to take practical action. But the irony is that in this part of the story, practical action alone, looking for not validation from others, some sort of evidence that my inner dialogue was wrong, was not the way forward either. The help with the inner narrative, the inner critic, and the inner dialogue would have been helpful at that point. But I didn't recognize it as a mental health challenge. I right until the point that I got diagnosed, bizarre as it sounds, I didn't connect what I was experiencing with poor mental health because the language, the organization didn't really talk about this stuff, like we'll be familiar with,
Okay.
with an organization at that level of maturity when it comes to mental health. So yeah, there was this yo-yo thinking. It was always back and forth. Some would say, potentially that's resilience, the ability to, gather yourself, suppress stuff, regroup, and go again. And that's what I pretty much did for the next 6 years. But looking back, I think it was a lack of emotional resilience and a lack of agility that actually led me down, in behavioral terms, the wrong path,
Mhm.
rather than recognizing that there was a different approach here. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. And I keep thinking back to that aspects of trying to think your way out of a thinking problem. I remember somebody
Mm.
saying to me a long time ago, trying to problem solve your way out of a psychological challenge is like trying to sniff your way out of a cocaine problem. It rarely ever comes to a solution. Yeah, and it's historically a very difficult thing for people to navigate if they haven't got, as you say there, the sort of organizational or cultural maturity to be able to have a conversation like that with the people around you. Otherwise, you go inside for the answers, and that's rarely ever the place.
Yeah, so as I've said, it's still a very difficult thing to recognize in yourself a significant dip in how you feel because you're constantly establishing these new norms, and sometimes you rely on other people to see it in you. But of course, the only people that are going to say that sort of stuff to you and make those observations are the people who are A, paying attention, and B, really care about you. So many
Mhm.
opportunities we've seen in the past where, and it was probably the same to a certain extent in my case, where people have seen stuff, but they've done nothing about it. They've said nothing. They haven't helped you, reorientate and point you in the right direction. Because again, objectively, you've got to recognise that people didn't necessarily know how. They didn't understand really what was going on, and link back the sense of identity again. I think in all of us, we just expected we're the sorts of people who, just get on with it, crack on, find a way forward. And it just tended to always lead to this sort of regroup and go again type response.
What was the point, sorry, from the organization where, despite a lack of, not want to say lack of support, but because of what had then obviously become an obvious deterioration in your own mental health, when was it taken away from you?
Yeah, not for a few years still. So in about 2013, I went to a staff job in a headquarters, sort of NATO headquarters, and again, I think the job was probably all right. Most people probably would have done well out of it, but this really developed sense of self-induced pressure was really kicking in. So at that point, I went to basically refer myself to the doctor. I knew something wasn't right. Didn't really have the language or the reference again to understand what it was. Hadn't assumed it was a mental health problem because I still didn't really have that language either. And I did start as a result of that, seeing what turned out to be, although I didn't really recognize it at the time, a psychiatric nurse, and sort of talking to me loosely about some sort of ideas, but there was no diagnosis or anything at this stage, and not really any clarity.
How did you even begin that conversation then? Sorry, if you knew something was wrong, because that's often the hardest point for most people. What was this growing sense that something's not right? I'm dealing with something in a different way than other people,
Mm,
or I don't seem to be coping very well. I don't see as my life pattern's going to be sustainable, the way that I seem to be thinking or behaving.
yeah, no, you're right to focusing on this because I think it's worth highlighting in the general context. It's
Because when someone says, what's really wrong, Tim? Why? What's the problem? I don't
yeah,
understand. Help me understand what it is. How do people even start when they don't have the language? How do you even start that conversation? How do you articulate it?
yeah. So if we assume, just like in my situation, no one observes it in you, no one approaches you. It's then on you to
Mhm.
recognise that you've crossed a threshold, as I call it, or a sort of breaking point. Not a breaking point in terms of you're about to fall over, but something's got to change here. Like the only person who's going to move in the right direction is me, and I need to understand what's going on. So I approach the doctor. Now, the doctor, this language is probably quite important. Um, you know, Typically would say, "How can I help you?" Very vague sort of doctor type introduction. And of course, the reality is at this point, you're like, you don't really know. It's like,
Yeah.
what's going on? Well, I don't really know the answer to that question either. But this is how I'm feeling. I feel
Mm.
like something's about to go wrong. Bracket suggestion of something anxiety related there. This impending sense of doom. Feel like I just can't get on top of my stuff. I'm always stressing. I'm never getting through my work. I'm starting to get this paranoia that other people are seeing a lack of performance in me. And actually, as a result of my inability to manage my stress and whatever this thing is, I'm starting to get judged for who I am. And
Mm.
that's something we can all tangibly pick up on, I think, in a work environment,
Mm.
particularly when we're familiar with people around us. This horrible sense that people are looking at you, judging you, um, their opportunities to socialize, they don't want to take them. And then the inner critic
Yeah.
kicks in again, like, what's wrong with me? Like, who am I becoming?
Mm.
Why am I pushing people away? And what I learned a while back
You
is,
almost then manifest it as well. It almost like you create the thing that you fear because you can't then act naturally around those people
yeah, you
around you
become,
because you do feel paranoid. You feel like you're being judged. You
yeah,
feel like you're incompetent, and that constant anxiety treadmill means that you do become shit because you can't focus on your work. You can't get anything done, and it just
yeah,
perpetuates that
yeah. And
fear that you're now manifesting.
it just kicks off this horrible cycle of, as I say, paranoia, insecurity, um, inner critic starts firing. You've got no more clarity because ultimately you're still trying to figure this out internally.
Mm.
But quite often, if someone can extract from you the basics of how you're feeling, how is this manifesting, as you say, we're not talking about symptoms or anything, but just describe something at
No.
work. Like, what are you thinking and feeling? What's going wrong? What's changed from
Yeah.
what you would consider you being on top of
That's
stuff?
an important point. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah,
What's changed? That's because that's always even when we think about general illness in terms of physical illness, it's like what's different now than what was 2 weeks ago? You say you've got a problem with your leg. Well, what was it like 2 weeks ago versus what it is now? And then we can start to connect the dots talking about no, sorry, I interrupted, but yeah, that thing of what do you think has changed?
yeah. I
Hmm.
think I think that again sometimes is quite difficult, as we've discussed, for the individual to really pick up on and express. And it's particularly difficult if, in the same context, if someone feels that they're developing an embarrassing physical condition, they're going to find it difficult to externalize that and share, even if someone asks, and even if that person is qualified. But based upon the average person's uh, self knowledge, ability to manage their stuff in high pressure environments, um, and mental health reference points, it's still a difficult thing to externalize, what has changed. And I think
Hmm.
that's quite often where the help of someone else in observing changes in behavior is really critical. And it's probably only in certain, highly developed, tight team-based cultures that that's probably a given. And
Hmm.
that psychological safety, um, that in that situation is really, really key, sadly is not present in all environments,
Hmm.
which is quite often, a massive barrier to what we call help seeking behavior. So
Hmm.
went to see the doc, a number of locum um, psychiatric nurses over that year or so. Ultimately, I still had the ability to walk away from this stuff because I felt I was repeating myself. It was exposing some stuff I found more stressful. I got this feeling that something was rising in my chest and I didn't like it. So this is an interesting point of debate because I had the ability to keep walking away from early intervention medical treatment. I'm too busy. The societal stuff comes back in. You're expected
Yeah.
to deliver outputs. You've only got 18 months left in this post. You've got to make a difference if you want to promote all that sort of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, all this BS that puts this pressure on you and reinforces this narrative where you go on this behavioral path in the wrong direction again. We're allowed
Hmm.
to we're allowed to pursue because at that time the medical chain didn't pull us back in and say no, 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 you can't walk away from this. Like, there's something
Yeah.
I can tell you from experience. There's something here. Like, we have to explore
Hmm.
this.
That's what makes it so much easier when it's a physical challenge. Because if like, well, you broke your leg or you snapped a tendon or
Yeah,
whatever, then you physically cannot go and do that thing. So we have to make a change now. But when it's an internal thing, it's yeah, it's harder to say, we need to stop now. Something needs to change now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, in many organizations, the thing that makes it harder for both the individual and the medical chain and leadership involved is that people are constantly moving. They're changing positions, they're moving jobs, they're changing locations. And
Now more than ever. Yeah.
I don't know whether it's evolves to date, to be honest, but and it may be an unrealistic solution. But in the best possible scenario, a medical system would be proactive enough that it followed you where you went, knowing that
Mm.
you weren't right when you last left the doctor's
Yeah.
room. And so that sort of stuff didn't happen. So it just carried on, carried on, carried on. And actually, I in the job after that, I spent about 6 months there. I'd never worked in that sort of area until then, and more of the same sort of stuff was building a building. I was doing things like driving to work with my wife's keys, and then realizing I had them, and then having to drive back and then back again. So I think in one week, at least on two occasions, I'd done 3 hours driving before I even got to work, purely because I basically just
Fucking hell.
lifted everything and everyone's admin and took it with me to work, so no one else could do what they were supposed to be doing. And then I got this impending sense of doom. Something's about to go wrong prior to Christmas Eve 2015. And again, the social stuff, the work related stuff comes in. So the BS excuses that enter your mind are you're going to drop a project, you're going to miss a deadline. Which of these plates I'm spinning is it? Like, reveal
Yeah.
yourself. And I went on two
Yeah.
weeks
Yeah.
leave and I came back. And then one morning, just after Christmas leave, I just hit the floor. Massive panic attack. First time it happened. Um, sort of calmed down from that. And I just had this, as people would describe, like this really dominant sense of flee. Just wanted to drive home, just be home. And then I completely broke down in my wife's arms that evening. And then everything came out. It was quite an acute breakdown. And then I was whisked in front of a psychiatrist emergency appointment within about 24 hours. And my CEO at the time was very good. Like he was, literally waiting out in the early hours, ready for the first person to come into the clinic and say, "This needs to happen now. This man needs an emergency appointment," because
Okay.
he'd known the backstory, and I very quickly got a diagnosis of complex PTSD, chronic depression, and alcohol disorder, which had really caused a lot of problems, in terms of compensating behaviour. And then,
What's
so to answer
alcohol
your question
disorder?
about
Because it's a
15 minutes,
different
15 minutes
terminology.
later,
Sorry. What's an alcohol disorder for
um,
people that are unfamiliar?
you know what? I've never really dug into it in detail because I've only just, really reconciled the impact it had on me and the relationship I had with it. And ultimately, it was a dependency on alcohol to, in my mind, alleviate and manage stress, which of course was the totally wrong thing to do, but very typical in terms of coping behavior.
Very
Um,
typical. Yeah.
that becomes it becomes I was basically an alcoholic, but I didn't realize it, and I was still functioning. I wouldn't be arrogant enough to say I was one of these sort of highly functioning alcoholics. I was still not necessarily clear
Mm.
on what that is, but I was getting by, and it was an addiction, it was a dependency, and it was the thing that I used to mask symptoms, suppress
I think that's
symptoms.
very prevalent in the emergency
Yeah,
services as well, also due to shift work, because a lot of people, when they come off shift in the morning, I know a lot of firefighters and paramedics that have a drink before they go to bed and we're great salesmen to ourselves. We say, oh, it helps me unwind or it helps me relax.
yeah,
But does it also, and it does, there's no two ways about it, it does blur and distort your reality a little bit to make it more palatable.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the bottom line that I realize now is that alcohol is a depressive. It's a suppressant. It has an effective initial suppressing impact. And
Yeah.
I I initially started drinking too much when I was fearful of having dreams and nightmares. I didn't want to relive the trauma, and so I would effectively
Really?
knock myself out each night to avoid that experience. And I think as a result of overuse, it then just became an embedded addicted habit like anything else. which becomes then very difficult to break. And then, of course, it starts over the long term to have more and more impact on sort of cognitive function. Of course, beyond the initial suppressing impact that we all sometimes relate to, a couple of glasses of wine, I can feel myself relaxing. You go too far every night, it actually completely screws your sleep. And I never wanted to
Mm.
believe that, but it is a fact. And it was
Oh
it
yeah,
was
there's so
only
much data
yeah,
behind how it
absolutely.
actually has the complete opposite effect. It distorts your body's ability for adenosine to operate in the
That's right.
system and help you go to sleep properly because it distorts and blocks some of the receptors. But yeah, people don't think that it actually just knocks you out eventually. It doesn't help you go to sleep at all. Your psychology is still operating at high speed behind that distortion. It's only a temporary solution to a long term problem.
Yeah, and of course, whether we've got our own stuff that we're trying to suppress, or it's the societal pressure again,
Hmm.
um, we tend to, not through any fault of our own, we tend to assume that we can consciously override the impact of caffeine, alcohol, fatty food, lack of sleep, because we are who we are. We just crack on we go. How dare you suggest
Yeah.
my performance isn't dropping? And I was that guy. I was that
Yeah.
guy for years.
Yeah. Yeah, we just apply cognitive horsepower to it.
Yeah,
So how did this eventually end up with you leaving the services? Was it as a result of that you were taken off duty? Just to give people an understanding that are perhaps in the very early stages of as you spoken through your story there, there'll be people that will relate to certain elements of
yeah,
it and perhaps looking across the table or looking at themselves in the mirror and going, you know what? No, I don't think I'm as bad as Tim, but I do a little bit of that. But no, I'm not like Tim. And
yeah, yeah.
we can, if we're not conscious enough, say, oh no, I'm not, again, it's that ego saying, oh no, that won't be me, I'm not that. But we're all probably somewhere on that spectrum.
No, that makes sense. I think the way I look back on my experience is that it all came out, and a lot came out in quite an acute way quite quickly. So it was pretty
Okay.
messy. And so I arguably, well, I accept I couldn't have carried on working over the short term doing what I was doing. The way I describe it is that my mind had hit the big red button and commanded my body to reset. And I was never going to hit that button myself.
No.
Um, and I remember a couple of years beforehand, before now, going on a stag do or something, and one of my former colleagues saying, like, I could see some of that in you, but I didn't realize it was a thing at the time, but you would never have left. Like, I was
Mm.
never going to opt out at that point because that sense of identity again was so dominant.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
so initially, yeah, it was quite messy. I was whatever the phrase is, I can't remember the lingo, but temporary unfit for duties or something,
yeah. Hmm.
temporarily put on sick leave. And then I remember quite quickly, off the back of the psychiatrist saying to me, in my experience, people with your symptoms don't recover. I plan for
Wow.
medical discharge. You won't deploy again. You won't lead again. Plan for medical discharge. Now, I've still got a very broken memory around the timelines of all this stuff, but it was clear probably within about 4 or 5 weeks that I wouldn't be coming back that soon. And and actually, I ended up being on sick leave for 18 months, and
Wow.
there was there was a fair amount going on, particularly in the early stages. Like, it felt like a drugs experiment. I think I was on 7 or 8 different medications at various times. The psychiatrist
Yeah.
trying to get it right. That didn't work. That made it worse. That worked a bit. Stick with that for a while. See how you go. That sort of stuff. And arguably, some of it helped, but some of it caused lots of problems. Um, so then I was permanently moved out of unit to a recovery unit, and again, I didn't know which way was up at this point. I then had what I now recognise, what they all recognise as a manic episode. So my thinking, again, the bounce back mentality, I didn't think helped here. Plus, maybe some of the drugs and those combinations, but I had quite a lot of delusions. My thinking about how I was going to bounce back and what I was going to do to again prove to myself that I wasn't written off. Um, led to me effectively doing some crazy stuff, spending all my family's money without asking my wife, getting myself in a lot of trouble.
No.
Um, and at the end of it, we effectively couldn't afford to live in our house, so we had to move out. Like, all this stuff played out as a result of
Oh, mate.
quite quite intense fluctuations in the nature of my thinking and the type of my thinking. And so
Yeah.
at that point, I was diagnosed as bipolar as well, unhealthily. And that was the point that they confirmed that I couldn't serve any longer because that was a barrier to service. So, of course, I didn't really wake up from this experience for a couple of years. It was only,
No.
as I say, some point in 2018 where I felt like I really got the clarity to reflect on the fact that A, that didn't need to happen, could have done it differently. And I started to accept it was no real fault of my own because I just gave myself to service, and ultimately I owned it, and that's what I want to help other people prevent. Um, so there was no point in the sort of medical discharge process where I would ever have had the clarity to be able to really objectively say, you know what, I'm going to fight this. This is nonsense. I'm not written off because I just went with it. I believed it because I recognized I was not well.
That's still not the ideal solution, even for the service or the organization, though, because without seeming cold, that's a tremendous cost to the organization and wouldn't really encourage people to join the sector. I know looking the other day that the average length of a paramedic's career is only 5 years. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying that's a direct result of mental health or anything like that. But when we looked at those layers of workload, self-sacrifice, poor self-maintenance habits and things like that, it doesn't, it's very hard to find a story, unfortunately, of people that begin down that slippery slope and are able to get a solid footing and navigate their way back up it. We seem to be learning all the stories from the people that end up at the bottom in a heap.
Yeah, I think that's how I relate to it. But I know for a fact there are people, have different experiences to me, but were certainly diagnosed with PTSD who either caught it early enough or with the right treatment and weren't medically discharged that are still serving. And I think that
Okay.
inconsistency is slightly hard to bear. But arguably, I'll come back to this point that
I'll
I
bet.
I recognised at the time that I was done for a good 12 months. Like I wasn't coming back and adding value to anything during that period of time.
Yeah.
But it's still a tough thing. But I think that point you mentioned there around sacrifice really needs to be recognised by leaders in the public sector because that is ultimately what people end up doing in many cases. They join, of course, because they think there's good values alignment that meets their sort of sense of identity and there's clear purpose in that job role and they see something in serving beyond themselves. But of
Mm.
course, working conditions in many public sector organisations mean that over time, arguably, there is a progressive degradation if people don't have the time,
Mhm.
space, permission, support, knowledge, education, resource, and all those other things, and they're not connecting around the subject. Um, and we all know that there are people falling over left, right, and centre, not just in the public sector, but in many organisations because
Mm.
of burnout, poor mental health, and so on. And I just don't think it's acceptable. Some people will be able to
No.
reconcile with it, look back, and learn lessons. Other people, it's going to seriously affect them, and of course, tragically, occasionally people take their lives as well. So, um, again, I come back to this point that often people don't pay attention until it's bad enough, and that can happen both at the
Mhm.
personal and the organisational context. And I think we've got to be at the point now where we've got to get further ahead of this.
So take me to, and you mentioned 2018. Was
Yeah.
that the moment after you'd worked with these leading mental health professionals and you were stable enough to begin to look on your experiences and reflection as to what was really missing? And then effectively what then turned itself into the purpose of Genesis?
Yeah. So I think I certainly wasn't uh, recovered in 2018. To a certain extent, that's going to be an ongoing process. There are things I still struggle with.
Mm.
Had a bad day yesterday. Spent a lot of time trying to figure out why is this feeling of anxiety coming back. And then I, recognized ultimately what I would say to someone else and practiced that, and off it went. But those
I
those
do that all the
those
time.
those two, those days
I'm terrible at it,
they
honestly, because
still come
I'm a
back and
recovered
and
addict.
hit you.
And
Oh yeah.
yeah, I'm a recovered addict, and I tend to create things that initially start as a tremendous passion, and they still remain a passion. The podcast is an example of it sometimes, unfortunately, where it then grows arms and legs of itself and can start to overshadow me like a big beast and start breathing down my neck. But I know it's the addict within me that creates that thing. But learning that that thing is just an internal thing that I, in fact, have control over. Just because you can articulate that doesn't mean that's how it feels every day. And that's, yeah, we're a bugger for that. But sorry, yeah, I relate to what you're saying.
No, I think it's a really interesting reflection because that ability to, having learned from the past and see oneself from the outside, often is what allows you to course correct, or prevent yourself from leading back in the wrong direction. So 2018, I think it was the first time I actually got some clarity looking back, and it helped me rationalize and depersonalize, those couple of years where I felt like I'd been written off, simply put, and then had that opportunity taken away me. I started to get less angry. So I went on a series of courses. I stopped spending my wife's money without her permission at this stage, and I went to study basics of neurolinguistic programming with the aim of understanding language, to ask myself better questions, understand a bit about the mind, really sort of get control of that inner critic. That's why I studied that. I trained as a personal trainer, but I didn't think that was the right fit for me. Ultimately, I thought that if I could understand physical health in more detail, I could get on top of mine, I could stop boozing and all that sort of stuff. But the day that I got caught after a client session, coming out of McDonald's, having just spoken to her about the benefits of good nutrition, I knew that my time was up as a personal trainer. So I moved on from that. But I just get going after more and more opportunities to generate a deeper understanding of the basics, so I can ask myself better questions, rationalize, accept, get less angry, and get moving forward again. And I think that's where I latched onto this idea of the development of mental fitness being a conscious and deliberate thing, that wherever we're at in life, whatever we've experienced, with the right support and with a sense of space, and clearly not really owning the same level of symptoms at that stage, you do have the ability to reset and go again. But this time, not from a self-induced pressure perspective. This time from a position of more clarity, more acceptance.
I always think, though, that all pressure is self-induced. We keep using this phrase of self-induced pressure, but I think there's no such thing as non-self-induced. Because when you say, oh, no, it's not me, it's pressure from work. No, you mean the value you place on your position at work and your identity as a competent man or woman has allowed you to give that thing power. There's no something kind of pressure over you. Like if someone tried to impose pressure on me to go and coach the local whatever kids volleyball team, if I don't value the local kids volleyball team, I'm going to feel no pressure at all. They can fucking send me as many emails as they like. But if it's something that I connect as part of my identity, I am a competent, proficient watch commander in whatever, then that is all pressure is self-created. And that's what's crazy about it, because that's when you realize it is within your sphere of control.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that idea of value and what we value being linked to pressure is really, really key. Often we can, find ourselves sort of meandering through phases of life with this horrible sense of pressure without the clarity of where it's coming from, because we're not quite clear, where we appropriate value to things. But pressure is ultimately a sense that something might go wrong. It's clearly linked to fear and this idea of anxiety building, and the consequences will either be bad or the consequences will come back on you personally. And I think that's why we probably refer to the phrase of self-induced pressure, because we recognize that we personalize it all the time, and quite wrongly sometimes we'll assume that we're doing it to ourselves. Where actually it's just it's something that naturally falls out of working environments, and often because of a lack of clarity, a lack of communication. And so if there's a lack of clarity in communication, people naturally make assumptions. They fill that space, and assumptions often create pressure.
Yeah. Well, we ask you spoke there a bit with the NLP aspect around asking better questions.
Yeah,
We tend to ask really crap questions like,
yeah,
why is this not working? If you ask your mind a stupid question and give you a stupid answer, it'll go, because you
yeah,
shit, Tim, because you're incompetent,
yeah,
because nobody likes you.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Which will just, it just begins to self perpetuate that self imposed pressure. But sorry, take us back to you were talking about NLP, PT, that the beginnings of that
Mm.
journey that eventually led you to
Sorry.
Genesis.
Yeah, so I think, at that point, up until that point, I never would have felt that I could have ever really added any value to anyone else from the experiences I've been through and the reflections I've made, because there was so much self doubt and lack of confidence. I was completely devoid of a personal sense of competence and capability. But when I realised that some of the feelings were starting to dissipate and I didn't feel the same as I did 6 months ago, although that was like I'd been in a complete time warp, I think I realized that I personally and authentically, for the right reasons, can get myself forward facing again, moving forward, back on track, although I don't know what that track looks like. And that's the path I followed. It's loosely that sort of path, I suppose, of refinding yourself, getting clarity, trying to identify, who it was you need support from. And I think this is the point where I realized that I do still need help from other people. I'm still not thinking my way
Mm-hmm.
out of this problem situation at this stage. And I probably cared less, to be honest. I cared less of what people thought of me, having gone from, socially very insecure, not wanting to leave the house, running back indoors and the neighbors came out, that sort of thing, to actually,
Really?
I saw this. Um, I'm not going to live the rest of my life feeling like this. And I just got an
Yeah.
inkling that there was potential for a better situation going forward. So I just started going after it.
That's a really fucking pivotal moment.
Yeah, it was,
Really
and it's
pivotal
what
moment.
I've referred to it already as the crossing of a threshold, and I hope some people can relate to this feeling, but quite often something builds from within, and you get a sense when it's linked to change that change is not far ahead of you. Now,
Yeah.
sometimes we can be so far away from a potential change and a positive shift, it doesn't seem realistic. Therefore,
Mm.
it just comes across like a goal. We don't really believe in it. Therefore, because we don't really believe in it, we don't then just focus on the next action or the next step. We don't move towards it. But
Mm.
sometimes, whether it's an experience you have, someone you meet, an environmental trigger, and this is what I recognize, something can change in you that's just an indication. Maybe it's come from your intuition or your gut, something like that. But that's what I call the recognition of a threshold. Like, I wasn't expecting it here and now, but it's not
Yeah.
far away. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know, when I cross it, it's not going to be a line
Yeah.
painted on the ground in front of me.
Mhm.
But something has
I
changed.
always think of that in the same way that I think of love and a lot of relationships and stuff like that. Sorry to go off down this rabbit hole, but it's like you get to a certain point when in a connection with a person where you realize, I love this person,
Mm,
but you don't know when it happened or how it happened, or there wasn't a moment in time where it
yeah,
suddenly happened. But at
yeah,
some point over all of these experiences and self-awareness and realizing my impact on them and how they appreciate me and how I'm treating myself or whatever it might be, eventually something just shifts. That's what makes it almost harder to articulate when you ask people, well, what was that threshold moment for you? When did it really change? And you're like,
yeah,
I don't really know. It's a combination of mental habits, physical habits, environment,
yeah,
experiences. It's so very hard, which also actually makes it even harder for the person that feels like they're in chaos because they don't really know what the lightning rod moment is that they're supposed to be getting. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
They don't know. Well, am I there yet? And you're like, well, I don't know. You only you'll know. Where your moment is.
yeah. It was a sort of, am I in heaven?
Yeah.
Where's the confirmation? But yeah, something you
Yeah.
said there, it got me painted a picture in my mind again that, in terms of relationships, no one's going to ring the bell and announce it's love. And there's going to be an immediate
No.
celebration. There's something just
Yeah.
shifts, something just changes. That realization
Yeah.
drops, um, and I think just to breathe a bit more life into this point in the crossing of this threshold, I think a something else that really had a profound impact on me was for the first time in my eldest son, seeing that my inability to manage my stuff when I had the opportunity to do a better job of it was rubbing off on him. That hit me hard.
Mm, mm,
That
yeah.
that that, prob- that probably was the end of any elements of victim mode or self pity, even though I think I'd had a tough time up until then. But it was a call to action. It was a holding to account, and that call to action really started to build that sense of belief that I could make a change. I also realized, because I used to get these weird delusional feelings sometimes. I had pictures in my mind, but sometimes I would get these images pop up about maybe what the future looked like. I realized that no one was going to come and knock on the door one day and say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Rushmere. I've just come to announce that PTSD, chronic depression, they're not a thing anymore. You've got permission to move
Yeah.
on." Like, that was never going to
Mhm.
happen. And I had up until then assumed that someone would make some sort of announcement.
Yeah. Because that's what happened the first time.
Yeah. So,
You were dropped
so
into this thing with a declaration. So there's no, like, it's almost like you drop off a cliff into it and then you have to climb the stairs out of it. You're not just
how
going
do
to
you
get to an
know when you're
elevator
out
where
of it?
somebody goes, there you go, 100%. Well, you don't, you know what I mean? And that's why it's a constant journey with it. It's almost like you actually just hit the peaks and valleys going on. And I remember doing some work with things like Headspace and a few other organizations that I've worked with before. And it's just this aspect of, like, it's like the weather. This too shall pass. Like you said, having a challenging day yesterday. Sometimes I have really fucking hard days, really hard days. And it's almost like everything I look at, I see as a piece of evidence as to why I'm shit, as to why I'm crap. Do you know what I mean? Everything that I seem to touch, I focus in on the negative, and it just really makes those days really hard. But I
Yeah,
try, and all this stoicism and all that sort of stuff is always nice to articulate. It doesn't make it any easier, but I have to try and hit that reset button and go, today is just a challenging day. This too shall pass. Do you know what I mean? This is not going to be forever. This is not my identity moving on
right.
always. But as I say to people, seeking you shall find. If you look for reasons why you're failing, you're bound to find them. But actually, if you can force yourself to identify reasons as to why you are worthy or why you do have value to add, you can find those as well. It's just hard.
Absolutely. And I think, quite often what I've discovered over the last few years is if you can understand the basics sometimes of biology and the science, the physiology, etc.,
Hmm.
that it helps you make more sense of it and then take the right action. And then I'll give you an example
Yeah.
that, you say there that ultimately we look for evidence. We talked about excuses earlier. Sometimes we make excuses to justify behavior, and therefore we just repeat a bad habit, one that we know that we'd rather not do. But
Hmm.
sometimes, linked to our negativity bias, which is designed to protect us, and the fact that
Mhm.
sometimes we're trying to reinforce our own bullshit, basically,
Yeah.
we'll constantly create thoughts naturally and automatically that often reinforce a narrative or potential approach that we'd rather not take. And so it's quite hard because
Yeah.
all that stuff's just filling our heads all the time, and
Mhm.
it's taking us in the opposite direction of where logically we feel that we need to be going. And I quite often, we talked about the reset button. I say quite often, I've thought in the past of installing fake reset buttons around the house to remind me to, whether take time
Well, you
out.
do
You know what I
have,
mean?
like, have you heard about some of the tennis analogies where they'll, take a band off one wrist and place it onto the other, or they will spin their racket twice, and they use these things as like a mental
Like
reset.
an anchor.
I saw one
Mm,
really good. There was a speaker, and you can actually see it. I don't know if it's just a habit they developed by accident, and then they just identified it afterwards. But they would do this thing where they would have a negative thought process, and they would touch their left
yeah,
temple as an analogy of pausing that negative bias, and then transition to the other side of the head. And it was just a physical
yeah,
anchoring to help them change their behavior. Some people have it with a clicker. Some people have it, like I say, with a band on their wrist. And it helps. Some people listen to that and they're like, "Oh, that's bollocks. It's bullshit." It's not. You know what I mean?
yeah,
That's how addicts and stuff get over stuff. I've helped people stop smoking and things like that. And you do have to change the record because they start playing a record in their head, and it just leads logically to different habits, different physical behaviors, and ultimately a
yeah.
destination they don't want to be.
And that makes complete sense to me. I've experienced a bit of this in some of the therapy I did, and this idea of like physical anchoring when certain things show up. There's a lot of evidence that's quite useful. There was an experience that I'd rather not repeat. I found a very good therapist in the end, trusted my life, and she was going through hypnosis one day, semi-conscious state. We're making some quite good progress with the hypnosis, so I bought into it, and what we were working on was effectively me trying to interrupt my not only thought pattern linked to drinking, particularly at the end of the day, but also interrupt the sort of the behavioural follow-on. And so what she had me doing was describing my route home from the office back to the house, as as I would experience it driving along the road. And I always had lots of challenges with these physical, hormonally driven cravings, which what craving is, showing up in response to, funnily enough, environmental triggers. The golden arches,
Yep.
2 for 1.
Yep.
All these things that they're designed to draw us in. They tap into a natural tendency to crave things, and a real nightmare if you've got a proper addiction to something. So I was talking through this route as I was driving with my eyes closed and semi unconscious, and without any warning, she would then, right in my ears, at the point I described I was about to pull up at the shop or go past the pub, clap her hands as loud as she could, and it scared the absolute shit out of me. But I could feel at the end of that session that something was different. Ultimately, it didn't necessarily work after one session, but what she was doing was trying to interrupt the pattern in my subconscious so that it would disrupt.
Well, you didn't build the addiction over one habit as well, either.
That's true.
You didn't build the addiction over one interaction. That's when people go, "Oh, well, I've done it and it didn't work." Yeah, but you didn't become addicted to the golden arches or to the habit just because you did it once.
Yeah.
You did that pattern day after day after day over years. So you have to, it's like a shower. I always say to people, you have to do this stuff on a daily basis. You can't just do it once and then go, it did or didn't work.
No.
There need to be habits that you refer to on a daily basis.
Yeah, because the habits need repetition if they're going to embed themselves in your subconscious. And I think the thing that was really unhelpful with alcohol for me was that, as I said, to start with, I was very conscious I was doing it to suppress dreams, to be able to disassociate, to take the fear out of things, knock myself out, etc. But then, having done so much of it, it just became an addiction that I just couldn't walk away from. Like many others. So the nature of the beast had changed. But yeah, it's just it's a journey that took time, and bit by bit got more clarity. Realized I actually could start helping other people, and funnily enough, I bumped into a guy, Ollie, who I'd been going through initial training at Sandhurst with in 2003. We hadn't seen each other for our whole military careers since that day, and we bumped into each other in the same village. We lived in the same village. And we happened to be going through similar experiences at the latter end of recovery. So we helped each other through that process. And what we realized was that, relatability, common struggle, bring people together. But there were common areas of experience, and there were common areas in terms of recovery that were working for both of us. And that's when we came up with the idea of formally putting something together where we could ultimately share our experience to help other people, either not go through the same experience or be able to pick up on those signs, earlier on.
How did you know there was a need for it? Obviously, you'd had your own personal experiences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that
we didn't start with.
Okay,
it just felt like the right thing to do, both for us personally, and it was a massive assumption that we made. So we just kept it simple to start with, and think we started off training as mental health first aid instructors, so we could deliver something recognizable. And we had made an assumption that clearly, because we've been through something, then we would relate. I think the irony is that quite often people end up on these courses quite rightly for their own reasons, just like me going on NLP courses and other things. And I was still wanting to seek to understand more and more detail around mental health in general, so I could stay on top of it. But within organizations, training people like mental health champions, mental health first aiders, and so on, quite often is just done to tick a box. And quite often,
Mm.
a proportion of the people that volunteer, if indeed they are volunteers, they are not doing it necessarily to serve others. I think you get more of that in public sector organisations because they see the problem within, so they want to help. But of
Yeah.
course, people have got to have capacity outside of their current work demand in order to actually help people, and then that becomes a challenge. So yeah, there's an element of it being sort of selfish at the time, and that I wanted to learn more, but they definitely felt like there was an opportunity and there was safety, in a partnership to come together, and maybe just maybe that would go in the direction of actually being able to help other people,
Mm.
either with what they're going through or recover from something or avoid the whole thing in the first place.
So since starting this journey, what's your experiences for yourself and Ollie Bain? Because you have worked with quite a large number of services. I mean, I was looking again
Yeah,
just before we came on, and some of the people that you've worked with, both from Police Scotland, South Yorkshire Police, Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service, you're building up quite a level of authenticity at the minute. When did you realise that this started to grow arms and legs, and that there was a need for it, certainly in the public, in the emergency services and first responder community?
Yeah, good question. It's I'm smiling because what I recognise is there's a link here to what we were talking about a little bit earlier around sort of not wanting to believe that you've actually got this sort of capability and this confidence to help other people, and that it can be quite destabilizing if that's something that really influences your mindset. So it seemed like a completely logical first step for us to become mental health first aid instructors, and we were working with largely corporate organizations at that stage. But I was very keen personally to develop our own material and to write our own courses and for it to be highly relatable. But actually, we saw a job come out from Police Scotland. I forget when it was, probably summer 2020. So we'd only been going about 15 months. And it was a pretty big requirement. It was ultimately to train 8,000 line managers, supervisors.
Bloody hell.
And to be fair, they had written their own requirement, and it was really well put together, and it was clear. So we just set about building a project team to deliver that job, and we found some great people. We found some great guys who were formerly in the Met Police, and they were negotiators, working with hostage crisis type situations, highly emotional people, and they had spent a lot of time off the back of actually having experience within the police in the leadership development space, mapping those skills across to ultimately the world of wellbeing, and particularly in how to help people like you and me plan and hold effective wellbeing conversations. And that was just one of the modules. So, this program involved the executive, which was great to see. That often doesn't happen. It's focused really on line managers, supervisors. It was inclusive. It was police staff and police officers. And it ended up taking us 15 months to deliver this program. And of course, something else happened about that time, didn't it? Which was COVID and lockdown. So luckily we were already on. Yeah. We were already online teaching virtually because we'd had a contract with South Yorkshire, and that again was supervisor focused, and that was good fun, and that went well. So there was a precedent, there was a bit of a track record, but it was a massive scale up, and we'd not done that before at that scale. We certainly hadn't spent 15 months delivering virtually out of a booth like this. And so there was a lot of repeat, 20 people in the morning, 20 new people in the afternoon, times about 6 instructors. It was an absolute beast. And it's honestly, it personally tested my energy levels because I don't like repeating myself. Although for some reason I can talk a lot, I just don't like the idea of repeating myself. And I feel like I'm never really showing up as good as I did yesterday. There's this sort of insecurity builds. But anyway, that was a leveling up experience for us, absolutely. But interestingly, at the end of that, great feedback, helped a lot of people. Usual sort of challenges, the live programs and so on. Lots of coordination, lots of no-shows, other stuff going on. Lots of natural wastage in terms of investment. It's planned for this many people. over the period. Not everyone attends. And that's the nature of that type of program, but largely successful. But Ollie and I we were always very direct in terms of reflection, looking back in on what we've just done. Have we done a good job? Could we do it better? And we just wondered whether live training like that was actually working. A single exposure for each person to module 1, module 2. What is that actually doing? Are we actually developing skill? Probably not. And of course, you've got to factor in the fact that in terms of level of maturity, in terms of understanding mental health and level of interest and investment in it as a subject, layering on top, was it mandated? Was it discretionary and optional? All these variables play a part in, was the learning effective? Did they have a good experience? Did we give them enough? And really that reflection, I suppose, finished up with our answer being probably not. How do we do it better?
Well, it's the same that we were just saying about behaviors and cultures earlier. Like, you can't just have one warm bath and expect that to be a change in behavior or culture moving forwards. It's something that needs to be frequent and reinforced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we had felt like we'd done a good job of supporting the people that wrote the requirement and the wellbeing team throughout. And one of the nice bits of feedback was our ability to basically work the problem solve during the course of a program. So we thought, right, what can we do to better support wellbeing teams and wellbeing leads, heads of HR people, those sorts of people, whilst making it as easy as possible for them, whilst not losing the crowd, because we're not boring them by just belt feeding them with knowledge and information.
Yeah.
Like, what are the answers to all those challenges? And so we set about creating Genesis with a view being that we would set to do all the hard work, or a lot of the hard work up front. It took us about a year to pull everything we'd ever created, plus what we'd just done, and some stuff we'd always wanted to develop, into a framework where we can effectively present it to an organization and they have the flexibility to implement it how they see fit, whether that's initially led by mental health champions, and then picked up by leaders at whatever level that's appropriate, or wherever the energy happens to be. Let's start there and then let's scale it up. But critically, all the content, the resources, the courses, the structure, the framework, the mechanisms all in place. So on the other side of that partnership, hence Elios partnership, that's potentially where the magic happens, because then the organization, such as yours, Pete, you can pick that up. You accept that it's a general framework where a lot of work has been done and a lot of your instructors have walked in your shoes, although they might not be exactly like you, and they've summarized stuff. Now, what you do with that, no one knows how powerful that can be, because you can use that framework around that resource, that general idea, as something to push off, have a conversation around, relate to in your own way, as a team of 4, 5, 6, or a shift of whatever. And I could never have done that to you. I could have never facilitated that for you in the same way. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely, yeah. Because then it becomes an internal tool that you can deploy, where as and where you feel it's appropriate, relevant to your sort of, like, say, local culture as well. How is your team going to best respond to something like this? Will it be a 3-hour whatever, or actually will it be a series of small 15-minute conversations?
That's it.
Over a period of months.
That's it. So we felt the mechanism was really important, and the bold claim here is that sadly people on the inside have got to do some of the work themselves. But if this is so important, why don't we just leverage the mechanisms we've got already in place and the structures, which are a leadership function and framework and a hierarchy? Mandate, yes or no, that's up to people. But the fact we talk to each other about other stuff. And now, given the fact that everyone is saying this is so important, we need to prioritize this, well, let's talk about this stuff. But let's make it easier for you by presenting it in a way where, chunk by chunk, in a bite-sized sense, you can just build this into the flow of work. It's 15 minutes to whatever you want to take, 30, 45, 1 hour, around a very specific idea, and you invite people to relate. You're not forcing anyone to do anything, You're not making people feel uncomfortable. You're not putting them on the spot. You're inviting people into the conversation. There is an opportunity there to explore all things mental health, human performance, rather than go with what a lot of people currently still feel is a threat and something to be avoided. Because unless we can build a sense of familiarity, confidence, developing sense of competence around skills actually being developed, and it's regular, arguably nothing's going to change.
100%. Totally agree. Look, I mean, there's, for people that are interested in learning a little bit more about it, I know they can jump on, and we're going to put a link in below, because they can just come on and see one of the demos for it as well.
Yeah.
But there's a whole host of insights and workshops. And again, echoing back to the authenticity aspect of it, all the case studies of the people that you've worked with are on the website. For people or organizations that do want to sort of reach out and learn a little bit more about it, what is the best way?
Well, the best way would be either phone us at our phone number, which is always nice when people pick up the phone.
Actual human connection.
Yeah.
That's strange. Might surprise some people.
That number, including digits, that's on the website, front and center. Or send us an email at inquire@eliospartnership.com. Connect with us via LinkedIn. Make it obvious you like to have a conversation. I want to learn a little bit more. But then, of course, we've got the recently launched emergency services peer community as well, which is for sort of forward-thinking pioneers in the emergency services. You can search that up on LinkedIn and explore who we are and what we're all about, and people have got in that community, and who's sharing ideas and where the opportunities are.
It's super valuable. I'm almost get tired of speaking to people who just talk about the problem and the fact that we need to do something about it, and the cost both to the economy but also the cost to the individuals, and then we look at the ever climbing rates of suicide, or the people that have life-changing circumstances and end up choosing to leave the professions rather than having tools that they can actually utilize. So it's been very reassuring for me, because this is actually something tangible where we're not just pointing at a problem and talking about its complexity. It's actually something people could go away and utilize.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us, an organization, to remember that this is really key stuff to people, both in their professional and their personal lives. So it has to be relatable, it has to be usable, it has to be sort of strategy, skill and tool focused. We're only going to normalize, the conversations if we're actually having the conversations, and that's what we've tried to make easy for people.
Firefighters Podcast is put together to develop, inspire, and hopefully even motivate those individuals who have chosen to serve our communities and be part of the first responder family. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield. If you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to see the podcast continuing, please head over to our Patreon page, where you can support the ongoing efforts of the podcast. Please hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on whatever platform you're listening to. Please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.